Have you ever heard a knock at the door in the middle of the night, not from any living soul, but as if from wandering spirits trying to find their way back? Out here in the West, where the wind howls through barren ridges and the clatter of hooves blends with the creak of rotting wood, folks tell of houses that can swallow a man's life in a single breath. Tonight's story is just like that, a tale of one man, a promised bride, and a ghostly shadow waiting on his very doorstep. If your heart has ever trembled at the thought of loneliness, if your eyes have ever gazed into darkness stretching to the far edge of an empty plain, then stay with me. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, so we can sit together night after night like around a campfire, and I'll share with you the haunting, blood-chilling tales of the Wild West. I promise you this is no gentle love ballad. This is a story that begins with a chill down your spine, and only the brave will dare see it through to the end. Silas Ward. His name once rang across battlefields, under the flash of gunfire, beside the cries of dying comrades. He had been a cavalryman, a rider through smoke and chaos, a man who'd seen blood spill until the very earth turned red. But that was more than 20 years ago. Now, Silas was only a shadow of himself, a man in his 40s with streaks of gray in his dark hair, calloused hands, and a sagging cabin planted in the middle of a desolate prairie. They say war may end for a nation, but in the hearts of survivors, it never really does. For Silas, the horror was not only in the bodies he'd once seen sprawled across battlefields, but in the silence that devoured every year after. He had once had a wife, a child. A sudden raid burned his home to ashes and left him with nothing. From that night forward, life was little more than a chain of gray, joyless days. Loneliness it doesn't kill quick like a bullet. It eats away, piece by piece, until a soul is nothing but scraps. Silas lived with the sound of the wind howling through the cracks, with the floorboards groaning beneath his boots each nightfall. Can you imagine sitting alone at a long dinner table, the chair across from you forever empty, for over 20 years? He lived like that, until one winter, when the fear of dying alone pressed down so heavy, it forced him to act. He gathered every coin he could from selling a few head of cattle, from hauling odd freight jobs, and placed it all into the hands of a broker named Victor Hale. Folks whispered Hale was a slick operator, a man who peddled marriages for profit, trading in desperation as if it were gold dust. Silas knew the man couldn't be trusted, but despair makes a man bargain with devils. That sum was all he had, and in return, Victor promised to bring him a bride, a woman who wanted to start over, who would accept a poor rancher's home in exchange for peace. From the day that promise was made, Silas changed. The cabin that had sagged in silence now rang with the hammer's thud and the saw's bite. He patched rotting walls, sealed cracks, swept away years of soot and cobwebs, built a new pine-wood table, and carefully set dried flowers on the windowsill, something he had not touched since the day his wife's coffin was lowered into the ground. Yet behind this flurry of repair lingered an unshakable chill. Each night, as he closed the door, the wind outside moaned like the sob of a widow. When he glanced into the old warped mirror on the wall, sometimes he thought he saw eyes that were not his own, empty, accusing, waiting. The feeling clung to him like a shadow, as though the house itself resisted his attempt to make it a home again. Silas pushed it aside, telling himself it was only the residue of memory. He whispered, "This spring, when the stagecoach arrives, a woman will step down, call my name, and everything will change." But deep down, every time he repeated the name Mariah, the name Victor Hale had scribbled on a torn piece of paper, his heart shuddered. He couldn't say why. Perhaps it was the way the name carried both hope and a strange taste of mourning. The night before the promise, the wind shrieked through the cracks like a chorus of the damned. On the table, The oil lamp sputtered, throwing his shadow long and crooked against the wall until it no longer resembled a man. Silas sat motionless, clutching his cowboy hat, heart pounding like it had back in the war. He knew something was coming, and it wasn't the dream he had been waiting for. It was the breath of a nightmare, one that had clung to this cabin for years, waiting for a bride to step across its threshold so the truth could finally be revealed. That stormy night came down as if the sky itself were collapsing. The wind screamed through distant canyons and tore across the prairie grass in front of Silas Ward's cabin. Rain whipped the sagging roof, each strike like a lash tearing flesh. The cabin door, braced as best as it could be, rattled and groaned as if it meant to rip free from its hinges, in the wavering glow of a nearly spent oil lamp. Silas sat stiff-backed, clutching his cowboy hat, his heart pounding, not sure if it was the storm or some nameless terror breathing just behind the walls. He had lived with solitude for years, but tonight solitude seemed alive, with a breath, with eyes, stalking him in every gust. Then came the sound of a slam that burst the door wide open, banging hard against the wall. The wind rushed in, dragging with it the raw stink of rain, of wet earth, and something worse, acrid, sour, like dried blood ground into rotting wood. Silas rose to his feet, gray eyes scanning the dark. And then he saw it. Hanging in the very center of the cabin he had repaired plank by plank was a body. The oil lamp flickered madly, spilling its sickly yellow light across a wedding dress, once white, now torn and filthy with mud. A woman's hair spilled forward, covering half her face. Bare feet swung gently, turning with each shriek of the wind that slipped through the open frame. For a frozen instant, Silas could not breathe. Every drop of blood in him turned to ice. The woman he had spent his life's savings to bring home. The bride he had been preparing for with flowers and fresh-cut timber, she hung before him like a discarded doll. A bolt of lightning split the sky, flooding the room with a blinding flash. In that white glare, he saw her face rigid, lips cracked and turning blue. His heart clenched until it nearly burst. The cowboy hat slipped from his hand and rolled across the floorboards. His mind went blank, filled only with one rasping thought. This cannot be. This cannot be real. He almost collapsed to his knees. And then something worse than silence happened. The woman's head twitched. A faint sound broke from her throat, fragile as wind through a crack, a moan, a plea. Silas jolted. She wasn't dead. She was still alive. Without thought, he lunged forward. His calloused hands shook but locked around the woman's body, taking her full weight against his chest. With his other hand, he ripped the hunting knife from his belt. Steel glinted in the dying lamplight. He clenched his teeth, slashed the rope. It groaned, frayed, and snapped. The body crashed down on him. Both of them slammed to the floor, the impact booming through the cabin, louder than the storm itself. Silas dropped to his knees, holding her tight. Her skin was ice. Dark bruises ringed her neck where the rope had bitten deep, crimson welts circling like brands. His rough voice cracked in despair. Dear God, what is happening here? He laid her across the wooden cot, clumsily brushing wet strands of hair from her face. Her lips trembled, rainwater spilling from the corners. Silas grabbed the water jug, tipped it to her mouth, dripping carefully. Most spilled down her chin, but then her throat stirred. She swallowed. A spark lit in Silas's chest. He leaned close, eyes locked on the trembling lashes. Slowly, heavily, her eyelids parted. Beneath them, dark eyes glistened, blurred with pain, but alive. They fixed on him, trying to focus. A frail hand lifted, clutching his wrist with all the desperate strength left in her. From her cracked lips slipped the faintest whisper, just a breath. Yet it thundered in his ears. Please, save. Silas's throat closed. Outside, the storm shrieked. Inside, the lamp guttered, shadows dancing. But what held him was the fragile thread of life dangling before him, ready to tear, and he knew this night had already rewritten his life. The storm raged on outside, but in that small cabin, a greater storm had already broken loose, the panic of a soul dragged back from the edge of the grave, and the terror of a weary man realizing he could not bear to lose again. While the rain still lashed against the roof outside, Silas sat motionless beside the bed, his hand clasping the cold, frail hand of Mariah. Her breathing was faint, fluttering like a candle about to go out, but that fragile breath pulled him backward, deep into the years he had tried so hard to bury. Tonight the cabin was not only filled with the storm's howl and the shadow of death, it had opened a door to a past that had once torn his heart apart. Silas Ward had once ridden as a cavalryman. He had galloped through smoke-thick fields, watched comrades drop in an instant, blood soaking the burning earth. Many nights he still dreamed of battle cries mixed with death groans, of a 17-year-old boy's trembling hand clutching at his coat before going still. War had carved scars all over his body, long gashes like cruel strokes of fate, deep wounds that never truly healed. But the greatest wound was not on his flesh. It was inside his chest. When he returned home, he was no longer the man who had left. Once, his world had held a wife and a young son. His wife, gentle and golden-haired, eyes the color of morning skies. His little boy had just learned to say P.A., toddling around the horse corral. They were his universe, the reason he endured years of slaughter to come back alive. But the frontier spares no man. One afternoon, as he returned from town, black smoke smeared the horizon. His homestead had been raided. He still remembered the screams, the gunfire, then the eerie silence when he crossed the threshold. His wife lay collapsed across the doorway, clutching their child to her chest. Both lifeless. Blood dried across them, their eyes wide open. In that moment, Silas nearly let himself fall and never rise again. From that day on, he became someone else. He stopped riding into town. He spoke to no one. He buried his family behind the cabin, then shut himself inside those weather-beaten walls. At night, the wind moaned like voices calling from the graves. At dawn, he led his horse into the fields, working himself raw until there was no strength left to think. Folks said he had become a ghost left over from the war, a bent man with empty eyes. Years passed that way, until he almost forgot what it felt like to have another hand touch his own. Yet one fear never left him, the fear of dying alone. When his hair turned gray and old wounds ached with every change of weather, he realized he had nothing left but echoes of the past. It was then, in that despair, that he turned to Victor Hale. He laid every coin he had saved onto the broker's table and said only, "Find me a wife. She doesn't need to be young or pretty. Just someone who wants to start over, to share a roof with me. I can't face the dark alone anymore." In his weathered eyes flickered the smallest spark of hope, fragile but real. That was how the name Mariah Kane entered his life, a promise of light in his dying cabin. To prepare for her, he mended the walls, built a new table, even placed dried flowers on the sill, things he had not done since burying his wife. For Silas, those small acts were sparks he dared coax from the ashes of his heart. But fate twisted cruel. Instead of a gentle smile stepping down from the stagecoach, he found a woman's body hanging in his cabin. All the years of grief surged back, smashing every fragile hope. And when Mariah's half-dead eyes opened, when that rasping "please save" broke the air, Silas knew fate was testing him again. Would he lose another life before his very eyes, as he had lost his wife and son? Or would he fight with everything left in him to hold her here that night, sitting beside a stranger? Silas felt his chest ache with grief and also with a strange, binding thread of empathy because he saw in her terror the mirror of his own past loss. Despair, the suffocating fear of being swallowed by loneliness. In that moment, two souls strangers until now touched one another in the deepest wound of all. In the damp darkness of the cabin, where the oil lamp had long since burned out and only the fire's glow flickered in the stove. Silas Ward sat beside the bed, watching the woman he had wrested back from death's grip. Her breathing was shallow, fragile as a thread. The rope had carved deep welts around her throat, angry red and purple marks that made him shudder each time his eyes fell upon them. He knew well, had he been a few seconds later, there would be nothing left in the room but a lifeless body. Mariah Kane stirred. Her heavy eyelids cracked open, her gaze blurred as though the light itself had nearly abandoned her. But still she tried to focus on the figure at her side. Silas leaned closer, his rough hand cradling her frail fingers, afraid that if he let go, her breath might vanish altogether. Her voice came, weak as the wind moving over open grass. "We'll kill you too." Every word tore from her throat like a knife drawn across raw flesh, and she winced with pain. Silas felt a chill crawl up his spine. He knew ambush and sudden death on battlefields, but hearing this warning here, inside his cabin, turned the little room into a war trench, shadows pressing in from every side. He tightened his grip on her hand and nodded firmly. "No one will harm you again. As long as I'm breathing, you're safe." Yet his mind reeled. Who had brought her here? Who had tied the noose? Why threaten him as well? The questions gnawed, but Silas understood answers could wait. What mattered now was keeping her alive. He rose and rummaged through an old chest. An aging work shirt, torn and worn thin, was ripped into strips. Silas knelt at her side, carefully winding the cloth around her bruised neck. His hands, once steady on rifles and reins, now fumbled awkwardly in the gentler task of tending wounds. Each time the fabric brushed her battered skin. Mariah hissed softly, and his chest clenched in guilt. "I'm sorry. I'll be gentle," he whispered, voice hoarse. He could not recall the last time such tender words had left his mouth. Perhaps it was years ago, when he comforted his young son frightened by thunder. And now, after decades of silence, the words slipped out again unbidden. Natural, like a hidden spring forcing its way out from stone. When the bandaging was done, Silas poured a little water, lifting it to her cracked lips. He steadied her head, tilting the jug so only a few drops slid down. Much spilled down her chin, dampening his shirt. But then, her throat worked. She swallowed. That small sound struck him like a hymn. Silas leaned close, eyes fixed on her trembling lashes. And then, slowly, they lifted. Her gaze, blurred and wet, found him. She did not speak, but he understood in this storm of pain she had found an anchor. Silas answered with a faint nod, his own eyes steady and sure. Outside, the gale still shrieked, battering the walls with rain. Yet inside, the presence of two strangers had created a fragile stillness, where suffering was met with care, and despair began to bend under the weight of compassion. Neither spoke it aloud, but both felt it. A thin thread of trust was beginning to weave between them. Silas remained by the bed, his hand never leaving hers. He knew he would not sleep this night. Perhaps he never would again. For once a man places his whole heart on the line to guard another's fragile life, his days are no longer his own. That morning, the sky was ashen, heavy like cold cinders. The rain had eased, but the wind still swept red dust across the prairie in thick, swirling veils. Silas Ward cracked the cabin door, squinting into the pale light. He hadn't closed his eyes all night, keeping watch over Mariah's breath. And then he heard it. Hoofbeats. At first a scattered rhythm, then swelling into a rolling thunder, like war drums pounding straight into his chest. Mariah stirred, fear flickering in her eyes, though still weak, She struggled upright, her gaze darting toward the window. Her lips quivered, whispering, They've come. Silas gave a slow nod. He had known this moment would come. That woman hadn't strung herself up in his cabin. Someone had brought her there, and those same hands would return to finish what they had begun. Through the morning haze, riders emerged 10 or so, rifles glinting cold beneath the rising sun. At their head rode Victor Hale, his pale face twisted into a wolfish grin, eyes burning with cruel delight. He looked at Silas as though the game had already been won. Silas stepped onto the porch. His wet boots creaked against the old planks. In his hands, the worn Winchester hung low, barrel pointed down, yet his finger rested firm upon the trigger. His shadow stretched long across the muddy ground, mingling with the thin gray light of dawn. Victor reined in, his voice booming with mockery. "Good morning. Ward, didn't I promise you a bride? Well, now you've got one. But too bad this little cabin will be the grave for you both." The men broke into laughter, harsh and jagged, a sound that scraped like dull knives. Inside, Mariah clutched the blanket tighter, her eyes locked on the lone figure standing against them all. Silas didn't answer right away. He drew a deep breath, chest heavy with the weight of old battlefields. He had spent years hiding from violence, from men, from the world. But every year of silence had led to this moment. He had no choice left but to stand. At last, his gravelly voice rolled out, low but steady. "If it's blood you want, then take mine. But no one touches her." The words hit the ground like sparks on dry grass. Victor's grin collapsed into a sneer, and with a sharp nod, he gave the order. Gunfire ripped through the morning. Bullets shrieked past, slamming into cabin walls, splintering wood. Window glass shattered. Horses screamed. Silas threw himself aside, pressing flat against the porch rail, then swung his rifle and fired. His first shot cracked through the haze, dropping a rider to the mud. Smoke rolled thick. Bullets whined close, chewing into the porch beams. Silas crouched low, breath steady, his body remembering the instincts of war. He fired again, then again, each shot deliberate, unflinching. Another gunman tumbled from his saddle. Another horse bolted shrieking into the dawn. Inside, Mariah pressed against the wall, trembling, but her eyes never left the door. In every muzzle flash outside, she saw him a lone man standing against a pack of wolves, her heart hammered, not only with terror, but with a fragile spark of faith. Victor roared above the storm of bullets, his voice thick with rage. "Ward, you're nothing but a lonely old fool. You think you can stand against me?" Silas bared his teeth, rifle raised, eyes lit with fire. His shout tore from his chest. Rough yet ringing, "I lost everything once. I won't lose again." The declaration cracked the morning open like thunder. In that instant, Silas was no longer a recluse hiding from the world. He was once more the soldier who had walked through fire and survived. A man willing to face death itself to protect the one fragile life behind him. The guns thundered on, smoke thick as fog. But through it all, one image stood clear: Silas Ward, alone on the porch, defying an army with nothing but a rifle, his courage burning brighter than the rising sun. Gunsmoke choked the yard in front of the cabin, thick as fog swallowing the dawn. Horses screamed, men shouted. Bullets sliced the air in a chaotic symphony of death. Silas Ward pressed his back against the splintered wall, heart pounding but breath steady, the same as it had once been in the trenches of war. Each time he leaned out with his Winchester, the muzzle flashed, and another man fell. The third, then the fourth. Blood spread dark across the rain-soaked red dirt, but the enemy was still many, their cries growing louder. A bullet tore past, ripping the brim of his hat, nearly grazing his skull. Silas dove sideways, rolling into a shallow trench by the porch. His back slammed against a post, pain flaring from an old wound, but he gritted his teeth and forced himself upright. One figure charged, revolver raised. Silas sprang up and fired twice. Steel clattered to the ground, the man collapsing lifeless on the porch steps. But then came the roar of another shot. Agony ripped through Silas's side, his knees buckling as hot blood poured beneath his shirt. Inside, Mariah gasped, a broken cry spilling from her lips. Too weak to run. She crawled to the window, her tear-filled eyes locked on the lone man fighting for them both. Silas staggered, but he did not fall. His hands trembled, yet the Winchester stayed firm. He lifted it and fired, dropping the gunman who had wounded him. The man spun, crumpled in the mud. And still, Victor Hale remained. Hale crouched behind his saddle, his face twisted with rage. As Silas dragged himself out of the trench, Victor surged forward, pistol leveled. Both men raised their weapons at once, steel barrels pointed directly at each other's hearts. For a breathless instant, time froze. Only the moan of wind through bullet holes, only the gray light of morning spilling across blood-stained ground. Mariah's breath caught. Her heart dangled on a thread. The shots cracked almost together. Flame leapt. Thunder echoed. Silas felt the searing burn rip through his side, the world tilting. But in that same instant, Victor jerked, eyes wide with shock. Blood blossomed across his chest. His breath hitched, then failed. He stumbled, collapsed into the dirt, eyes frozen in disbelief before death claimed him. The smoke slowly drifted away, leaving behind the acrid stench of powder heavy in the air. Silence fell over the yard. Only Silas's ragged breathing remained, blood dripping onto the porch boards. He still stood there, though swaying. Winchester clutched in his hand, gray eyes fixed on Hale's lifeless body. A bitter, broken laugh escaped his throat, not joy, but the cruel irony of survival. He had lived through one more battle. Mariah staggered out, falling to her knees beside him. Her trembling hands pressed against his wound, tears streaming unchecked. In that moment she understood this man had not fought to preserve only his own life. He had fought for hers, for the fragile chance they now shared to keep living. Silas laid a blood-stained hand over hers, his eyes, clouded with pain yet still burning steady, met hers. He gave a faint shake of his head, as if to say, "Don't cry. I'm still here." And in that instant, all the horrors Mariah had endured the noose, the jeering laughter of the gunman faded away. Before her was only a scarred man with a heart of stone, who had stood unflinching in a storm of bullets to shelter her. The morning wind swept across the yard, carrying the bitter smoke, the copper tang of blood, and a vow left unspoken neither of them would ever face the fight alone again. The acrid haze of gun smoke still hung heavy in the air when new hoofbeats sounded in the distance. This time, it wasn't enemies. It was the urgent rhythm of neighbors. Within minutes, riders appeared from all directions, farmers, cattlemen, homesteaders scattered across the harsh land. They had heard the thunder of gunfire at dawn, and instinct had driven them here. The scene before them froze every tongue. Bodies of gunmen lay sprawled in the wet earth. Horses had bolted, saddles and rifles strewn in the mud. The porch of the cabin was riddled with holes, beams splintered and sagging. And in the center of it all stood Silas Ward, bloodied, worn, still clutching his Winchester, gray eyes hollow but unbowed. At his side knelt Mariah Kane, tears streaking her face, but her gaze lit with something new, the light of freedom. Clark, the rancher from the east, was first to dismount. He scanned the yard, then slowly removed his hat, voice low and grave. "Lord above, what happened here?" Silas turned, exhaustion dragging down his voice as he pointed toward the lifeless form of Victor Hale in the mud. "He strung her up in my cabin, to draw me into a trap. He wanted land, wanted money. And she wasn't the only one. A hush fell. The women among the riders stiffened. They exchanged stricken looks, then whispered names their daughters, sisters, friends who had vanished in recent months. And suddenly, the truth sharpened like a knife. The disappearances weren't the work of drifters or accidents out on the trail, as folks had been led to believe. It was Victor Hale and his men. They had hunted the vulnerable, used them, discarded them. Anger rippled through the gathering like a wildfire. Men's fists clenched. One mother buried her face in a rag that still carried the faint scent of her lost child. Clark's jaw worked as he spat words through his teeth. "We've been blind too long. And you, Silas, you stood against them alone." All eyes turned toward him. For years he had been the recluse, the broken soldier who shunned town. But now they saw something else, a scarred man who had faced down evil when no one else did. Not a ghost on the margins, but a voice raised for what was right. The neighbors moved quickly. Some dragged bodies together. Others gathered weapons. A few climbed the porch to beat out the flames smoldering on the roof. Rough hands, calloused from plows and branding irons, worked as one like a company of soldiers answering a silent call. No one gave orders. It was simply understood this fight belonged to all of them. Mariah was wrapped in a heavy blanket and helped onto the porch. Her face was pale, the rope's cruel imprint still carved around her neck, but the hollow despair had gone. She stood upright, leaning against the battered post, watching as the community rallied. To her, it was proof that life and the dignity of a woman could not be buried under the lies of a villain. Silas sank onto the steps, pressing a hand to the bleeding wound at his side, his shirt dark with blood. One of the men knelt beside him, reaching for bandages, but Silas brushed him off gently. His eyes sought only Mariah. In her gaze he saw the reflection of his own grief shared now, not carried alone. When the yard had quieted, Clark returned and laid a firm hand on his shoulder. "You're not alone anymore. Ward, what happened here tonight? None of us will forget." Silas said nothing, only gave a faint nod, his eyes drifting to the cabin. Its walls were scarred with bullet holes, smoke still curling from the roof, but it still stood. Just like him, battered, wounded, but unbroken. Mariah, free at last, crossed to him and lowered herself beside him. Her small hand slid into his, roughened fingers closing over hers. And in that touch, both felt the same unspoken vow the storms would come again, but they would never face them alone. Dawn came slowly that morning, the first light slipping through thin clouds still stained with the smoke of gunfire. Across the prairie, dew clung to each blade of grass, sparkling like 1,000 shards of glass. There were no more thundering hoofbeats, no more rifles cracking the silence. Only birdsong mingled with the soft breath of the wind. On the bullet-riddled porch, Silas Ward sat beside Mariah Kane. His wounds were bandaged, blood still seeping through, but his eyes were gentler now. His rough, calloused hand held her smaller one. That simple grasp, fragile as it seemed, bound 2 lives pulled back from the edge of the grave. Mariah leaned lightly against his shoulder, breathing in the scent of burnt wood, damp earth, and a new dawn. To her, the man once called the ghost of war was no longer a shadow, but a steadfast anchor. To Silas, the warmth of her hand told him the truth. This cabin, once a prison of grief, had become a home. Neighbors lingered in the yard, gathering weapons, hauling bodies, stamping out smoldering fires, but none dared disturb the two on the porch. They knew this moment belonged to them, the ones who had endured the longest night of their lives. Silas glanced at the battered cabin, walls scarred with holes, roof still smoking. He sighed, then smiled faintly. "We'll rebuild," he murmured, voice raw but steady. Mariah turned, eyes shining through the mist. "Yes, we'll rebuild." But this time, it will be our home." Her words hung in the air like a quiet hymn. After terror and bloodshed, what remained was not despair, but a beginning. Beyond the horizon, the sun rose higher, spilling honey-gold light across the fields. From somewhere far off came the crow of a rooster, the bark of a dog, the laughter of children. Life was returning, yet not as it had been. It was new, as though even the land itself bore witness to the rebirth of a home. Silas tightened his grip on her hand. The lines on his face were no longer just scars of loss. They marked a man who had dared to stand. He had lost wife and child, lived years in shadow. But now, looking into Mariah's eyes, he knew happiness could still belong to those who refused to yield. Mariah whispered softly, eyes closing, "Without you, I'd be gone. But I don't want to just survive. I want to live with you." Silas listened, heart aching and warm. He made no grand promises, only gave a firm nod. On this harsh frontier, a nod carried more weight than 1,000 vows. When the work in the yard was done, the neighbors returned to offer farewells, their eyes filled with respect. The recluse of the prairie was now a man reborn, no longer hidden in solitude, but standing tall in their eyes. And Mariah, the woman cut down from the noose, would never again be forced to bow to fear. As the sun climbed higher, Silas and Mariah remained on the porch, hands joined. Words were unnecessary. Both knew the road ahead would be hard. The cabin had to be rebuilt from ruin. The land remained dry, the harvest uncertain. But they had each other, and that was enough. If you've listened this far, perhaps your own heart has stirred, because the West in this story is not only a land of gun smoke and wide plains, it is a mirror of our lives. Happiness never comes to those who sit in silence and wait. It comes to those who stand, who fight to protect life and love, even when death looms close. Silas Ward was no longer the soldier he once was. Yet last night he found reason to raise a rifle again, not to kill for gain, but to preserve a fragile breath, to shield a heart beating beside his own. And in that moment, both he and Mariah were reborn. The question for us now is this: in such a moment, would we have the courage Silas showed? Would we grip the hand, reaching for ours? Even if it meant facing a pack of wolves alone, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. If you believe Silas and Mariah deserve their new home, leave them your support. How would you like to see them rebuild? Should they plant crops, raise more horses, or carve out a place of peace together? And don't forget to subscribe. Each time you return, I'll bring another tale of the Wild West where loss, hope, and courage meet to remind us all in every age. Happiness belongs to those who dare to rise.